Queria também agradecer a presença de todos. Temos aqui pessoas do Brasil todo, temos pessoas da Latam ICF, muito bem-vindos. Temos pessoas da ICF pelo mundo todo, então muito bem-vindos também aqui ao nosso evento ICF Brasil. As perguntas elas vão ser centralizadas no Q&A, por favor, utilizem esse mecanismo. No chat a gente não vai acompanhar perguntas, tá? Fiquem no Q&A. E agora eu convido a Cândida, a presidente do Chapter Brasil, para dar as honras da casa.
Tá bom, obrigada, Ilana. Thank you, Ilana. Antes de começar, ainda antes de introduzir a Cindy, eu gostaria de passar um recado importante aqui para os nossos associados, que até a semana que vem, até dia 31 de março, é o nosso prazo para renovação com a ICF Global. Então, quem ainda não fez a renovação, temos até quarta-feira que vem, por favor, continuem aqui conosco, porque vocês vão ter a oportunidade de participar de mais eventos como esses, e muitas outras coisas que a gente está programando para vocês, tá? Então, era esse o recadinho que eu queria deixar aqui. E quem tiver alguma dúvida sobre o processo de renovação, qualquer questão, por favor, deixa um e-mail, envia um e-mail, eu vou pôr depois aqui no chat, para diretoria.associados@icfbrasil.org, tá? A gente ajuda vocês aí nesse processo. Então, now, in English, for Cindy, I'd like to introduce Cindy Wigglesworth. Cindy is the president and founder of Deep Change, Inc. Since 2000, she has been running her own company doing consulting, leadership development work, training and coaching for major organizations. Prior to Deep Change, she worked for 20 years at ExxonMobil in human resources, including a senior management position in this area. She is the creator of SQ21, a validated expertly created assessment of spiritual intelligence. She is the best-selling author of SQ21, 21 Skills of Spiritual Intelligence. Cindy is a popular speaker, consultant, trainer, executive coach, and has appeared at TEDx events, numerous conferences, and on TV, radio, and podcast programs. She's also involved in the conscious capitalism movement. We are extremely happy to have her in this webinar, and she will focus on the 4 intelligence of a leader, conducting a deep dive into spiritual intelligence. At the end of her presentation, Cindy will share with us how SQ21 is related to the ICF core coaching competencies. Cindy, it's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Candida. It's wonderful to be here, and many thanks to Carlos and the study group for making this all happen. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And there we go. All right, I believe we are on full screen now. So as you heard, the title of this talk is The 4 Intelligences of a Leader, and we're going to take in particular a deep dive into the intelligence known as spiritual intelligence. We're going to cover what is the 4 intelligences of a leader: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. I will focus especially on how EQ, or emotional intelligence, and SQ are related to each other. And then I will dive into what is the SQ21 and how is it related to the ICF core coaching competencies. You've heard my background, so I'm going to skip over this slide. And I'll talk briefly about how I got interested in this. When I went to work for Exxon, I had come out of college with good grades and an overemphasis in my own IQ. I tried to solve all problems with my brain, and eventually realized that it was not always successful. Later learning that this concept that we now call emotional intelligence or interpersonal skills was hugely important to personal success and professional success. And that got me interested in the whole field of multiple intelligences. as I matured as a leader and on my own, I started doing personal growth work, I realized that there was yet another intelligence, the intelligence that we call spiritual intelligence, that was making a huge difference in my leadership capacities. And that led me eventually to leave Exxon to do the research that led to this book. When I left Exxon to do this research, one of the places I looked for inspiration was Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He's a well-known psychologist who had talked about how we begin at the bottom of the pyramid and then we go up from our physiological or body needs for survival to our safety needs, to our belonging needs, and so on. His original pyramid ended at self-actualization. Often that is explained as being all you can be, like being what you are meant to be in terms of your career. So like finding out what you're good at and being successful. As he continued his research and before he died, he realized it was more complicated and that there was a level beyond self-actualization, which he called self-transcendence. And at this level, people became less about their personal ego and much more committed to being of service to other people and to the planet. This is where I see spiritual intelligence being connected to Abraham Maslow's model. It's the actualizing of our highest self or our spiritual self, and that's where we'll be headed today. Before we get into the four intelligences, it is helpful to define the word intelligence. I define the word intelligence using what is common in the world of psychology as these 2 points. The first is that it is an innate potential that is brought into form through practice. And here you see a little girl practicing the piano. If she is born musically gifted, she may have the innate potential for high musical intelligence. But if she does not ever practice, if she does not study music theory, she cannot bring her musical gifts into the world. Similarly, I believe that all people are born with the potential for spiritual intelligence. But like musical intelligence, it is a set of skills that has to be developed through practice. The end result of practice is that you get good at the thing that you're working at. You become adept, or you get good at the behaviors of music or the behaviors of spiritual intelligence. One way to look at the four intelligences of a leader is to think about them as having separate lines. Like you might be highly developed on the IQ line, very, very smart, but maybe not so well developed at the emotional intelligence line. You've probably worked with or maybe for someone who was very smart and had terrible interpersonal skills. So it shows that you can be well developed on one line of intelligence and maybe not so well developed on another line of intelligence. So they're somewhat independent. And that's IQ, emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, and PQ is physical intelligence. So this is a partially true way of understanding the four intelligences. This pyramid is another partially true way of understanding the four intelligences. Here you see them in a developmental sequence from the bottom up. If you have raised children or been around young children, you have noticed that when babies come into the world, they have a great deal to understand. They have to learn how to focus their eyes, how to lift their head, how to roll over, how to crawl, how to walk. At the beginning of our lives, there is a lot of body awareness and skillful use that we have to learn. This is not to say that the brain is not developing simultaneously. It absolutely is. But in this simplified model, you can think of it as physical intelligence as the foundation and the first thing that babies start working on. Now, IQ is beginning, of course, at the same time, and the children go off to school and they continue to develop their physical intelligence. But now school focuses heavily on IQ, or math and verbal intelligences in particular. In the United States, people have college entrance exams they prepare for called the SATs. I suspect you have similar kinds of exams that you go through as you go through school. So schools generally focus more on IQ than on EQ. Some schools now are focusing on emotional intelligence, and that's wonderful. As we get out of school and we begin having romantic relationships and working at jobs, it becomes increasingly important to get good at interpersonal skills. So IQ becomes not sufficient to being successful in your personal life or being successful in your professional life. So you next find that the pressure builds to develop emotional intelligence skills. In addition, our brains are not fully developed for doing emotional intelligence until we're about age 25. So there's some limitation on how much emotional intelligence you can develop as a set of skills until the brain is fully formed. And then at the top of the pyramid is spiritual intelligence. And here I define this as your inner wisdom being guided by compassion. And we're going to go more into that definition later. But EQ and SQ have a special relationship to each other. And here you can see it with these arrows. A little bit of emotional intelligence helps you begin your spiritual intelligence work. After that, spiritual intelligence accelerates your emotional intelligence, and emotional intelligence accelerates your spiritual intelligence. So they become a virtuous circle of one helping the other. And they're very interconnected, as I hope to show you in a few moments. This is a model of emotional intelligence that was developed by Daniel Goleman and Richard Boyatzis. It is perhaps the most famous model of emotional intelligence. In this model, they have 4 quadrants, and in these 4 quadrants, they place various skills. The quadrant in the upper left is self-awareness. The quadrant in the upper right is social awareness. The quadrant in the lower left is self-management, and the quadrant in the lower right is relationship skills, or sometimes they call it social skills. You see the yellow arrows going from the upper left and coming around to the lower right. If you want to have good relationship skills and have a positive impact on other people, you have to start in the upper left quadrant. You must develop your self-awareness before you can really develop your social awareness. You have to develop self-awareness before you develop self-management, and all of those help you build relationship skills. And it is because of this 4-quadrant model that I ended up creating a parallel 4-quadrant model for spiritual intelligence. So you're going to see something very similar coming soon with the spiritual intelligence model. Now you keep this in mind. Here are the skills that go in those boxes. Now this model has changed. At the time I got trained in it, there were 18 skills. They've sometimes changed the number of skills that go into each of these boxes. But what has not changed are the skills in the bold yellow letters. These are the 3 meta skills, as Daniel Goleman once called them. These are skills that you cannot skip if you want to develop good social skills. And they are emotional self-awareness, empathy, and emotional self-control. Emotional self-awareness means I understand the emotion I'm feeling at the time that I feel it. I can name it, like I feel angry, and I can understand what triggered it. Empathy means I can see that you are angry, and I can understand why you might be angry. And self-management, emotional self-control, means when I'm triggered into anger, I know how to manage myself. From those 3 skills, you can have the potential for conflict management in the lower right-hand quadrant. You can imagine if you can't identify or have empathy with someone else's anger or manage your anger, it would be very hard to handle conflict. So how do people build emotional intelligence skills? You have to start in the upper left to end up in the lower right. And in order to start in the upper left, we need feedback from other people about how we are doing in our relationships. So feedback from our supervisors or from our coaches in helping us understand where we're going wrong, where we're missing the mark, why we're offending people, why people don't understand us. It drives us from the things we're not doing well back into self-awareness where we can begin to improve. So I was trained in emotional intelligence, loved it, found it super helpful, and was looking for the equivalent in spiritual intelligence. I looked and could not find anyone doing research in this field, and that's how I ended up going into doing the research myself. So let's move into spiritual intelligence. One of the things I like to do to help people get started thinking about this is to ask them, before I tell you what spiritual intelligence is, why don't you tell me what you think about a couple of really important questions? The first question is to name some people who you admire, and admires a very important word. And these people are people you consider to be spiritual leaders. You decide what you mean by that, but to you, you consider them spiritual leaders. If you have a piece of paper, take a pencil or a pen, write down a few names of people that you consider to be spiritual leaders. They could be alive or dead. You may never have met them. They could even be fictional characters, people from movies or books that you really admired, and they don't have to be perfect people. So jot down at least one or two names. Then I'd like you to think about, what are the character traits of these people? What causes you to admire them? Something about them is special. Try to describe it. Write down a couple of words. Okay, I have done this exercise now with thousands of people in many different countries. And what I find quite fascinating is the degree of similarity that emerges no matter where I am. So for the first question, name some people who you admire. A typical list might include people like this. Now, there is some variability based on the country I'm in, but oftentimes major religious figures will appear, such as Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Moses, Abraham, Lord Krishna, various saints, the Dalai Lama, and so on. Political leaders and change agents might be listed. People like Gandhi or Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Thich Nhat Hanh, and so on. Sometimes people will list their relatives, their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, their teachers or local religious leaders. They might list authors or TV personalities that have influenced them and helped them. And in some cases, they list their coworkers. I did a lot of work with healthcare over the years, and oftentimes nurses would say, my patients are spiritual leaders to me. They teach me so much. I have had several people list their bosses as spiritual leaders, which just goes to show it is possible to be a boss and to be considered as a spiritual leader. Now, there's some similarity, fairly good similarity that will occur in this list. Maybe you saw a few names here that are common on your list. But what I find even more fascinating are the characteristics that tend to show up. And there is usually a very high degree of commonality across the lists. And it's fun sometimes to do this as a table exercise, to have people just brainstorm the characteristics of spiritual leaders, and then we'll flip chart them at the front of the room and call them out. And we get lists like this. They're loving and compassionate. They're humble, wise, courageous, faithful, forgiving, accepting, calm and centered, have honesty, integrity, or authenticity. They are peaceful or nonviolent, wonderful teachers, able to inspire other people, great leaders, persistent in the face of great difficulty, and capable of seeing the gifts inside of other people and developing them. This is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a flavor of the kinds of commonalities that we tend to see. And hopefully this resonates for you. This feels true for you. Maybe it matches a few of the words that you wrote down. What I find fascinating about this is that even though the field of spiritual intelligence had not really been developed, if I get a room of people together and we talk about spiritual leaders and we talk about the common traits of spiritual leaders, the same characteristics come up again and again. I find this quite inspiring. And then I will ask people, is there any characteristic on this list that you would not want to see in your workplace? And generally people go, I want all of this. I want all of this in my workplace. In one situation, I did have a leader say, I'm a little concerned about compassion. And I asked her why. And this was in a medical facility. She was a doctor. And I could tell that she was very pained asking this question. And so I asked her to explain what she meant. And she said, what I worry about is that I'm an oncologist and I have to perform surgeries on face and neck tumors. And she said, I often leave people horribly scarred as a result of the work I do. If I have too much compassion, I could not do this work. And so then we talked about what's the difference between empathy and compassion. And it's a very important distinction. Once she, and I'm going to walk through that in a few slides. But once she understood the difference between empathy and compassion and the fact that wisdom could be added to the mix to know that you are serving the highest good of this person and you are working at their request to extend their lives, then she was totally on board with this list. So that was wonderful. So once we do this exercise, I then move into a conversation about what is spirituality, what is religion, and what is spiritual intelligence. Because the biggest barrier to this conversation working in a workplace is often the confusion about religion. And are you coming in here to convert me to something? So we quickly get into the definitions and just talk about it. Here's my definition of spirituality. Spirituality is an innate human need to be connected to something larger than ourselves, something that we consider to be sacred or noble, or perhaps you would say divine. Now I say it's an innate human need because I'm linking back to the work of Abraham Maslow, who at the very top of his pyramid, beyond the self-actualizers, were the self-transcenders, people who were committed to something larger than themselves. So my assumption in this model is to align with him and to say that there is an innate human need to be connected to something larger than ourselves, something that feels sacred or noble and is not just about me or my own egoic needs. So that's how I define spirituality. In this sense, everyone is spiritual. Religion is a structure that can help us meet our spiritual needs. When I say a structure, I'm talking about it has a set of beliefs. It often has a founder, a sacred text or multiple texts, sacred buildings, sacred rituals, and a lot of practices, doctrines, and dogmas. Religion can be very helpful, or it can get in the way of expressing your spirituality. So just because you're born spiritual doesn't mean you will develop your spirituality. And just because you're in a religion does not necessarily mean you will develop your spirituality. It is possible for people to be religious, but to not seem very spiritual. And it is possible for people to be spiritual without necessarily being in a religion. So I think it can be helpful to tease those two definitions apart. To me, as I looked at that list of spiritual leaders, what kept coming to me was that these people behave with love. But love, at least in the English language, is a very sloppy word. We say, I love my children and I love ice cream, and those are not the same. I did not want to use Greek or Latin words, so I went looking for a definition of love that was simple, easy to remember, and felt true. I found this beautiful parable from the Eastern traditions that love is a bird with two wings. One wing is wisdom, the other wing is compassion. If either wing is broken, the bird cannot fly. I just found that so beautiful. Wisdom is the best of the head, compassion the best of the heart. They come together to make the bird. Together, they can do loving action. So that was where I began. And here is the definition I came up with. That spiritual intelligence is the ability to behave with wisdom and compassion, love, while maintaining inner and outer peace, regardless of the situation. To look at that in its pieces, the ability to behave is important. It is much easier to love people in the abstract when you're meditating, when you're out on the beach, when you're out hiking in the mountains. But when you're dealing with people in the workplace, when you're dealing with people in traffic in the middle of Sao Paulo, how can you find love for other human beings? So somehow the ability to not just have feelings of love in the abstract, but to behave with love, to show up with actions of love, that's the first piece. The second piece is while maintaining inner and outer peace. Inner peace and outer peace, why two of these? Well, you can look peaceful on the outside and be very upset on the inside. I have often found that doctors and nurses are very good at maintaining calm on the outside, but if they are upset on the inside, they will be exhausted, they will burn out. So finding a new state of mind and a new state of heart where you're calm on the inside makes it more sustainable to be calm on the outside. And then the final note here is regardless of the situation. This is the saintly level of spiritual intelligence, where you are able to behave with love while maintaining inner and outer peace, no matter how crazy, how difficult, how awful the situation might be. Now, if you think about that definition and you think about the spiritual leaders that you listed earlier, hopefully you will see a lot of overlap. Go, yeah, that's what makes those people different. There's something beyond IQ, beyond EQ that makes them different. And this somewhat describes it. So let's look a little deeper at empathy and compassion. I like to think about it I used to use a 4-level hierarchy. I have shifted to a 5-level hierarchy. And these words in English hopefully will work okay in Spanish or Portuguese. At the bottom in English, we might say antipathy, which means I don't like you. And in recent times, we have become so polarized that we can dislike other people knowing nothing about them except their political party or their religion or what part of the country they live in or whatever. So I've had to add a 5th level here to say we're so agitated these days that sometimes we're starting in dislike of other people. And if we could just move up 1 level to I don't care, apathy, I will ignore you, maybe that would be an improvement in terms of our social interactions. It's sad to say, but a little bit humorous and a little not humorous. So we go from antipathy, which is dislike, to apathy, which is I don't care. I don't see you, I ignore you. Above apathy is sympathy. Sympathy means I see you, I notice that you're suffering, and it makes me uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable because it's kind of uncomfortable for me that you're uncomfortable. It's not so much that I'm feeling empathy for you yet. I'm not quite there. It's more like pity. It's like one up and one down. I'm okay, you're not okay. I am noticing that you are not okay, which is an improvement. So at least I'm noticing that you're not okay. And maybe I'll write a check to a charity that can help you so that I don't have to be distressed by seeing your suffering. But sympathy is a step up. In this developmental ladder, it is an important step up. From sympathy, we go to empathy. Empathy is a peer-to-peer connection. I feel like I am your equal. I see that you are suffering. Your suffering is my suffering. Your grief is in my body. I feel sadness when you feel sadness. When you are angry, I get upset as well. When you're joyful, I feel your joy. So empathy is a peer-to-peer relationship. From this place, we are much more likely to help people because they feel seen. And this is a healthy kind of connection. This is the emotional intelligence skill of empathy. The issue with empathy is it can be exhausting. Too much empathy makes us withdraw and pull back and stop helping because we can't handle the overwhelming sadness of what we're feeling. Compassion is the step above empathy. And what the research has shown is that when you reach compassion, you are able to keep everything about empathy. You keep it all, except for that you turn off the distress circuit in your brain. You're no longer so distressed, and you are able to engage in action and feel gratified by the actions you're taking. So it becomes a much more sustainable place from which to behave, which gets us back to behaving with love. So how do we do this? How do we do this spiritual intelligence thing? Well, essentially it boils down to getting out of our immature ego self. And here you see a woman who is pointing and blaming someone else, or a man who's very narcissistically self-obsessed and combing the one hair that is left on his head. This is immature ego. And we want to shift from that to our higher self. Some synonyms for the ego self include, you might call it your personality self, or your embodied self, or your human self. We have a lot of glossaries of terms on our website, deepchange.com, under resources, if you want to look more into words and synonyms. What we want to shift to is our higher nature. And I just love these images. This woman and this man just look like they have seen a lot of life, but somehow they're still finding joy in the world. She is smiling, and it appears that she has no teeth left, but I don't think she cares. She's just smiling. It's wonderful. And his face just looks very wise as well. Synonyms for the higher self might include your soul, your spirit. In Hinduism, they say Atman. You might call it Christ consciousness, your Buddha nature, your divine nature, your non-dual self, your witnessing self, or your authentic self. There are more synonyms possible for this, and I like to be very generous with synonyms. I like to have generic words like higher self, and let people bring their cultural or spiritual or religious terminology to it. My intention for this model is to be faith-friendly, faith-neutral, and atheist-friendly, so that everyone can find a way to connect to this language. Looking at this just a little bit more, the ego is the part of us that tends to be fearful, angry, to feel separated from other people. It tends to engage in a lot of drama. I sometimes will ask managers, if you could get rid of the drama in your organization, how much productivity do you think you would get back? Or said in reverse, how much productivity are you losing to unnecessary drama? the lowest number I ever got was 10% of the day to unnecessary drama. More common would be 20 or 30% of the day is lost to unnecessary conflicts between people and egos competing and drama that doesn't need to happen. Now, the ego is not the enemy. It is a necessary part of us to function, but it is prone, especially when it is immature, to overreacting. The higher self, or our spiritual side, or our soul, whichever part of this language that you like, is the part of us that you might like words as it's eternal, or maybe you don't like that word, but you might say it's fearless, compassionate, wise, and peaceful. Maybe you would feel that it's in touch with deep joy. It seeks unity rather than trying to find separation and argument. So it sees unity with other people, unity with all of life, unity with whatever you might term source or God or the universe, or perhaps unity with some very noble cause. The goal of spiritual intelligence is to put the ego in the navigator's seat instead of the driver's seat of the car. For most of us, we grow up and the ego is driving the car and it's slamming on the brakes and it's screaming at the other drivers, generally being quite high drama and high conflict. If we put the higher self in the driver's seat, it stays focused on its higher purpose, stays focused on its core values. It's calm, it's connected to the sense of interconnection of all life, and it partners with the ego. I see the ego as a helpful navigator because every other human on the planet has an ego. Your ego understands other people's egos. I don't think the goal should ever be to destroy the ego. It's to grow it up and put it in service to your highest self, your most authentic self. Now, when I created this model, I kept all of the spiritual leaders in mind that you saw listed on that other page. And I thought these kinds of people have something above emotional intelligence. It's like if you took the emotional intelligence 4 quadrants and laid them out this way, and then you put another piece of paper on top of it, it would be EQ and then SQ. What would the 4 quadrants above EQ look like? And so you see, I started here labeling higher self, ego self-awareness as the upper left quadrant. The capital S self is the higher self. The lower S is the ego self. So we begin with awareness again, self-awareness, but this time ego self, higher self-awareness. The second quadrant, instead of being social awareness like it is for emotional intelligence, is universal awareness. The third quadrant, instead of being self-management, is ego self, higher self mastery. And then the fourth quadrant, which is the outcome quadrant again, is social mastery and spiritual presence. I then populated these quadrants with the skills I felt exemplary spiritual leaders demonstrated. Now, one leader might not have all 21 of these skills, but collectively, I felt like these 21 skills described what it meant to be a spiritually intelligent leader. We went through focus groups, we talked about it at great length, made some changes to this, and then the next level was to take these 21 skills and describe each of them from the level of a novice to the level of an expert. So level 1 is the novice level. And here I'm looking at skill 5, which is awareness of my ego self and higher self. At level 1, all I have to do is have a basic understanding that an ego self exists. At level 2, I can observe my own ego in operation. At level 3, which is becoming more difficult, I can recognize the situations and types of people that trigger my ego self to want to take charge. What this means is I have been observing my ego for long enough that I am seeing the patterns of where I get triggered. So my self-awareness is growing. At level 4, I have developed enough spiritual practices that I can consistently hear the voice of my higher self. And at level 5, which is the highest level we know how to describe, the voice of my higher self is now the principal voice I hear. Ego is now in joyful service to spirit or higher self. So this is a very high level of skill attainment. We described all of the skills in this degree of detail. Here is another example of a skill that's very important. Skill 5 is very important. Skill 7 is very important. Skill 7 is being aware of other people's worldviews. And here, level 1 means I listen to differing points of view. That's all you have to do, is listen. At level 2, I seek opportunities to learn about other worldviews. Now, a worldview is a perspective on the world, a view of the world. It is the bundle of beliefs that you have and interpretations that you have, many of which are not conscious, that help you to make sense of the world. So at level 1, I will listen to people with different points of view. At level 2, I'm getting curious. I seek opportunities to learn about other people's points of view. At level 3, I tune into other people's worldviews, even during a conflict. At level 4, I have compassion for the hopes and fears that we all experience as human beings, no matter how much you can't stand that person, no matter that you may see them as evil. You have some compassion for the fact that they too have hopes and fears, and that those things are causing them to have certain perspectives about life. And at level 5, you have developed this to the level that you can see through the perspective of other people, no matter who they are, even the people who might act to harm you. This is clearly a saintly level of attainment. So there's 21 skills. We don't have time to look at all of them, but let me shift now to give you the single most important tip for how to develop spiritual intelligence. I will tell you that my guiding question, my guiding principle is that I want to show up as love. So my guiding question is, what would love do? Remember, love is a core part of spiritual intelligence. As I try to integrate my spirituality into my daily life, I can look at it this way. I have an event in my life, and I have a response that I make to that event. And that response could be something I think, and maybe I ruminate on it. I keep thinking it again and again and again. Or it could be an emotion. I get angry, I get upset, I get anxious, I get sad. It could be something I say, it could be something I do, but I have a response. The beginning of spirituality is learning to insert a pause between the stimulus, the event, and the response. In the pause is your power. No pause, no ability to choose. If you pause, you can remind yourself of your higher purpose, your core values, your guiding question. I ask myself, what is the loving thing to do in this situation? I calm myself down and I try to have the best response I possibly can in the moment. So let's talk about how this connects to coaching for you. Spiritual intelligence is a skills-based approach, as you can see. There's 21 skills. Each of these 21 skills is described from level 1 to level 5. You can help people assess where they are. You can help them develop their skills. It takes the next step beyond emotional intelligence. So you would need some emotional intelligence first to really begin to work on spiritual intelligence. It provides a map for developmental growth, which is really helpful and a big part of why I wanted to do this. I needed a map for my own growth. I wanted to be a better person. How could I do that? This map was in large part designed to help me, as well as other people, grow up and become a better human. And finally, it provides a map for spiritual development and a pathway to help people get there. There are some core competencies. There's quite a few that are connected to SQ, but these in particular you might see as being highly related. The ability to maintain your presence, including remaining observant, empathic, and curious. To be comfortable working in the space of not knowing. We get trapped in a desire to be the expert sometimes, and a core advantage of this posture, of holding this loving, calm, healing posture, is to the wisdom to realize you don't know everything. And sometimes holding the space of not knowing is the biggest gift you can give your client. The second, evoking awareness, using powerful questions, and there are over 150 questions in the spiritual intelligence assessment, which is, it's a self-assessment that help a person think about what are their values, what is their worldview, how do they feel about different things that are very related to spiritual intelligence and emotional intelligence and being successful personally and professionally. These powerful questions can help the client explore way beyond their current thinking. I have had coaches who use this tool say they go deeper, faster with the spiritual intelligence assessment than with anything else they've ever used. It can support the client in reframing. Reframing meaning seeing with new eyes, looking through the perspective of other people, looking through the perspective of gratitude, considering how you might think about things in a different way. And then finally, facilitating client growth, partnering with them to transform their learning and gain insight into actions they might take in the future. Specifically, 3 skills from the SQ21 model I will highlight for you. If you can get to this place of being a calm and healing presence, that will be a tremendous benefit to yourself, but to your clients as well. That is skill 20. The second one, being a wise and effective leader and change agent, is skill 18. As you are able to find this place of the best of the mind wisdom and the best of the heart compassion, you will help people find options and reframe situations to find new ways of interacting with their reality. And then skill 19, making wise and compassionate decisions, you will be a role model to your clients of how to take a more mature approach to situations, and you'll be able to hopefully guide them into doing the same. Now, what if you are interested in learning more about SQ21? I would suggest that you go to deepchange.com, and we have a lot of free resources there. Go to the resources page. You can also buy the book. It's available on Kindle, paperback, and audiobook. We are working hard to get a translation into Portuguese. We do not have an agreement yet, but we are working on one. So we're hoping in the next year to have the book available in Portuguese. It is available in Spanish already. You can also go to our training site through deepchangeuniversity.com, and there is a free video and there's a free white paper there. There's also videos and white paper on our deepchange.com resources page. You can sign up for additional training at deepchangeuniversity.com if you are intrigued. You can take the SQ21 self-assessment and get your own coaching session. Carlos will be joining me in a minute, and there is a very active group of coaches who can help you. And then you can also get certified if you want to become certified in the SQ21 tool. So you can learn more about emotional intelligence. I have a training program on that, and you can also become certified. So I think at this point, we've used up the 45 minutes for presentation, and it would be a good time to go to questions. So I will stop sharing.
Hello, thank you very much, Cindy, for your presentation, very enlightening. I'd like to thank all the questions that we have in the Q&A, and now to introduce Carlos Miziara. He's a ICF member, and he's in the change as you presented him, and he'll be doing all the questions for you.
Okay, Ilana, thank you very much. Cindy, thank you for a great presentation. Let me start talking about the corporate world. We have a few questions here about that, and you kind of touched that in your presentation. And first question is typical obstacles to talk about spiritual intelligence in the corporate world. And there is a segue question here in terms of how to increase the level of spirituality, the acceptance of that at the corporate arena, particularly among the CEOs, and what to do to increase their perception of the value of spirituality or spiritual intelligence to their organization. So if you can focus on the corporate world, would be great, Cindy.
I would be happy to do that. When I present in most situations, let me back up. I customize every presentation for every client. I think about what are their problems, what are their strengths, what do they need from me? So I customize within that context. I think about, are they ready for spiritual intelligence yet? Or can I help them become ready? The guiding question is always, what is the loving thing to do for this client? I do not go in with the, how do I sell spiritual intelligence? I go in with a service orientation to say, what is their situation? How can I help them? If I can't help them, I refer them to another coach or consultant. But almost all the time, they want the 4 intelligences of leadership. I have found that to be the best single approach. So I come in and I talk about the 4 intelligences. We might spend a good bit of time on emotional intelligence. We might talk about what is physical intelligence when you're an executive. How do you handle yourself for maximum corporate performance? Get good sleep, take care of your body, manage your stress, all of those things. And when I show the pyramid of the 4 intelligences, I may say, we're going to focus on emotional intelligence today, but I'm going to tell you a little about spiritual intelligence because that comes next. You might not be ready for it yet, but when you're ready, I want you to know we have this other next intelligence that will amplify your performance even beyond emotional intelligence. I find that because of the high achievement orientation of most executives, they hate that I won't tell them more about spiritual intelligence. I just say, well, you can learn about that later when you're ready. You're really not ready yet. Wait a minute, I'm ready. So that's one tip. Second tip is if they are interested, begin with the exercises I began with today. Name your spiritual leaders. Name the character traits you admire. Have them tell you what they admire before you tell them anything. Because they will feel, if you begin telling them, they will feel that you're trying to convert them to something. If they choose for themselves, we like those character traits. We want those character traits in our business. Okay, now let's talk about how we can get there. And then I launch into what is spirituality, what is religion, what is spiritual intelligence, because the immediate fear is religion. So you have to very quickly define your terms and define them clearly, calmly, no threat. Oh, okay, I see this is a set of skills. And then these 21 skills, you don't have to learn them all. You learn the ones that are helpful for you right now, and we'll figure out which ones those are, because some of those skills may not be interesting.
Thank you very much. Now, bringing back to us, another question that came was how can we as coaches assist and be at service to our clients with our own, with the development of our own spiritual intelligence? If you now put the focus on ourselves as coaches.
Right. I have found it's very hard to lead anybody to a place you're not willing to go to yourself. So if you have not been willing to do the work, it's hard to suggest to a client that they should do the work. They want to know that you've gone there first and you've tried and what has worked for you. So I would say being a role model of doing the work. What is the work? There's a handy little 4 the integral world uses this little memory aid to help you. And this is to wake up, grow up, clean up, and show up. So I will briefly explain that. To wake up is to have the aha moment when you realize the ego is not the whole story. And it's sometimes shocking to realize the identity of Cindy that I have constructed as so important is really not all that important. And there's a whole deeper level of an authentic self below that, behind that, above that, and to focus on that. So that's the waking up, is to realize there's something transcendent in the world and I'm curious about it. To grow up means to do the developmental work yourself. And many of us leave school, we come out at the expert level, we're expert at a whole bunch of things, and then we move into what is sometimes called the achiever level. And then there's the individualist and the strategist. You can look these up on the internet. They're quite interesting descriptions of developmental levels. But it basically means you're growing up. And as you grow up, my research has proven that your SQ and your developmental level will go together. So SQ facilitates developmental growth. If you're doing your own work, it's the way you will best help your client. You need to be at least a half a step ahead of your client to help them. So wake up, do the growing up, do the cleaning up. Cleaning up means your shadow and the things you have not faced in yourself, where you tend to project issues onto other people. So it's reflecting and doing some cleanup work. Therapy can be helpful with this. Spiritual work can be helpful. And then show up. Show up in the world. Don't just meditate on a cushion and think enlightenment will come and you will be the savior of your clients. There's work in the world needing to be done. And so show up and get embarrassed because you make mistakes, and learn from the mistakes and seek feedback. Be part of the process.
Thank you very much for the tips.
Mm-hmm.
Now I see a question around the book from Donna Zohar, Spiritual Intelligence. And the question is, what are the similarities or the difference, the alignment of your concepts with this founding, let's say, book in the field of spiritual intelligence?
So I liked her book and I heard her speak at a conference, but I found it did not help me because it did not, number one, have a roadmap. It did not have an assessment. In fact, at that time, she said, you can't measure this. I think she's changed that and has developed an assessment many years later. This was a long time ago. But at that time, she was saying you can't measure it. And I'm like, I need something more like emotional intelligence. I need something with skills. I need something we can build an assessment around. I need something we can build training around. So while I found her ideas about the coherence of the brain and megahertz around the brain and different things quite interesting, I didn't find it specific enough or helpful enough. I am not familiar with her most current work.
Good, thank you. And then there is a question, Cindy, to go deeper into empathy. You touched empathy and compassion, but if you can go a little deeper on that, particularly talking about empathy, that's not just putting ourselves in the other shoes. Can you go a little deeper on the empathy and the compassion interconnection?
Yes. So empathy is actually a very complicated set of brain parts. There's a wonderful book. I will find it and put it in the chat. It's on my bookshelf. So we'll take a break at some point and I'll put it in the chat. I think it's called The Science of Evil, which is an odd name. Yes, is that it, Carlos?
Yeah, that's it, The Science of Evil.
Science of Evil, where the scientist was curious as to what caused people to become cruel, which means there's a lack of empathy. And he became curious and they started mapping. And the parts of there's at least 13 parts of the brain that are involved in empathy, which, so if you really want to dig deep, I recommend that book. In a psychological standpoint, what does that mean? There's a lot of different ways in which empathy can go wrong. In essence, there are two really important parts of empathy. One is empathy that is just cognitive, where I learn through practice that your facial expression, your tone of voice, and your body posture means you're sad. Or I learned that those things that you're expressing right now mean you're furious or something, you know, so it becomes a learned ability to put myself into the other person, those signals, or to say, if I were in their situation, I would be feeling angry. So I imagine Tom or whomever is feeling angry right now. That's a cognitive form of empathy. There's another form of empathy called affective empathy, which means it's like mirror neurons. Your anger communicates straight to me, into my limbic system, and I feel it, or your happiness, or your sadness. The ability for emotions to transfer between people is well documented. And so that affective empathy is often very, very strong in certain people, to the point where they can feel overwhelmed easily by strong emotions in the room. Compassion means I learn how to manage all of that, so I don't feel overwhelmed by involuntarily picking up people's emotions, and I don't feel like I have to think so hard all the time. I've kind of gotten good at guessing and sensing and anticipating, but I'm not overwhelmed by it, and I develop the skills to intervene appropriately.
Thank you. I think there's another question on a topic you mentioned, and it's related to the balance between the higher self and ego, the analogy about driving the car, in terms of how can we find this better balance in terms of driving the car and the tension between the lower self, the ego, and the higher self. You touched on that, but there was a request for going a little deeper on that.
Yes, so there's a 9-step process in the book, but I can shortcut it to the 4-step version, the 4-step shortcut. Stop, observe, understand, and love. SOUL. So stop, pause. Whatever you're about to do by knee-jerk reaction is your ego, right? So take a breath, mental pause, physical pause, long, slow, deep breath to calm your system down. Observe, that's the O. Notice what's happening to yourself, that you're being triggered, that things are happening in your body, and notice what's happening for the other person. Go into the mindfulness space and observe. Understand is to take the effort to try and imagine, I've just made this person really angry. I can see all the signs of it. I'm not going to make this about me. I'm going to seek to understand what happened here and be curious. Maybe ask a question. I'm so sorry. What's going on? Did I say something? Seek to understand, and then find a loving response. And a loving response can be many things. It could be asking the question, I'm so sorry, what is happening? I think I've upset you. The best you can do in some days is just to leave the room. Like, I'm going to bite this person's head off if I don't walk out of the room right now. So I'm going to declare a bathroom break and leave for a couple of moments to go hang out in the bathroom until I can calm down. Or I can tell the person, I'm going to call you back in a few minutes, or I'll call you back tomorrow with the answer to your question. Insert a long enough pause that you can come back with a loving response. SOUL, stop, observe, seek to understand, find a loving response.
Good, thank you. Practical tip. And then thinking about our development, or human development, if you see a correlation between spiritual intelligence and our maturity, our development, our experience in life.
Yes. You want me to talk about that?
Yes, please. That's a good question about that, in terms of that correlation.
Yes. So there's a characteristic of people with spiritual intelligence, and it's humility. Humility means I'm not so convinced I'm right all the time. And as you go through life, if you go through life seeking to learn, seeking to grow, seeking to clean up and show up, you get humbled by life. So one of the characteristics of maturity is that you are open and simultaneously strong. It's paradoxical. A lot of paradoxes start showing up with mature people. So I can be open to listening and learning, and I can also know when to say, no way. This is a firm boundary and you cannot pass. A lot of times people do spiritual work and I think they get confused that they have to be all forgiving about all things. And forgiveness is a very complicated term. Forgiveness to me does not mean you forgive and forget. You forgive and remember. You can release the emotional attachment, but you remember what happened so that you can keep boundaries with people. And that level of ability to hold complex thoughts and paradoxical thoughts is typical of spiritual maturity and maturity on the ego development scales as well.
Maybe we can talk about another paradox, because there was a question, and it's quoting that book, Conversations with God, that claiming the author, he says that freedom is to live your life without expectation, without the need for specific results. That is divinity. And then bringing that to a coaching process, how can we work in a flow state, align it with our higher self, and at the same time support our client to move from current state to desired goal, point A to point B? So how can we manage this paradox, this polarity?
It is a really fun complexity to play with, because what Neil Donald Walsh is describing is what Buddhism would call non-attachment. Non-attachment means I'm okay if it doesn't go my way. Like if it rains or if it doesn't rain, I will be okay. It's like I'm not attached to a specific outcome. But it's not detachment or non-caring. And so it's kind of subtle. So you can stay in this place of very big picture perspective that it'll all be okay, and I'm not the boss of the universe, and maybe I don't even know what the best outcome is in this situation. So, and I believe that I can be okay no matter whether it's raining or not, no matter whether, this person gets elected or that person gets elected. And at the same time, and is such a big word, and at the same time, it's okay to care passionately. So you can be non-attached to specific outcomes in the global, big, higher self sense, and you can be passionately concerned about the plight of a particular community in your neighborhood and care very much that something improve in that. And to hold both of those, it's a bit crazy making at first, but it is, I think, what we are called to do. It's to sustain faith in hard times, means to hold that really big perspective that I can't know everything. I can't know God's mind. I can't know what the universe is up to here. And I know I feel deeply called right now to help this particular situation. All right, so how do you apply that to a client? A client has a goal. They, I want to be president of the company. You hold that with them as their goal, but it's not your goal, it's their goal. And their goal can change over time. What you know is that they're ambitious, right? And they want to move to the next step, whatever the next step is. I found in my own life, sometimes I take the next step and that's great. And then I take the next step and I go, I didn't really want this. I got the 2 more promotions and then I go, I didn't really want that. So there's a sense of being fluid and being okay if the goal changes, and people change. When I was in my 20s and 30s, my goals were quite different than they were in my 40s, 50s, and now in my 60s. Being fluid around that. So the core question for the coach is, what's the loving thing to do to support your client at this moment, given their level of development, given their level of understanding, given the goals they are setting for themselves, without you being attached to, I, as the coach, am a failure if they don't become president. That would be an egoic attachment to a goal that the client set. Let the client set the goal, help them in every way you can, and be flexible if they change their mind, and be flexible if it doesn't happen and they want to find another path for themselves. So that would be my thought.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are several questions here, and then moving to more from an organization standpoint. The question is, in your experience, is there any particular type of organization that is more prone, more interest in this type of approach with developing the four intelligence, the deep intelligence, based on your experience in working with several companies around the world?
Yes, I would say healthcare companies tend to be quite receptive to this because they are dealing with suffering, death, and dying. They are confronted with human suffering and pain in ways that other companies often are not. So for the safety, sanity, physical, mental, emotional health of their employees, it can be quite important that they have all these intelligences handled, including spiritual intelligence. Also found companies affiliated with conscious capitalism are already moving in this direction. They're very interested in EQ and SQ. They want to live their purpose and values, which is very aligned with the work of SQ. Done a lot of work with Whole Foods in particular. John Mackey, of course, wrote the foreword to the paperback version of the book. And, you know, he's very committed as a core value for love. So I would say anybody affiliated with conscious capitalism might be interested. Privately owned companies are often easier than publicly owned companies because the CEO has more direct control. So those would be my 3 tips.
Good, thank you. Now, there are several questions about a current very critical topic, and particularly coming from Brazil, the COVID-19 pandemic. So some questions around how spiritual intelligence can help us to navigate to this very, I would say, chaotic environment that we're living in the world and around, particularly here in Brazil. And also a question about if you believe that now being broader, the pandemic situation could lead us, people, to be wiser and more compassionate with others than before this came. So talking a little about a very topical moment.
Okay, so for me, this last year has caused me to have to use every spiritual intelligence skill I have ever developed in terms of keeping a sane perspective, trying to stay calm in the face of chaos, trying to be kind when I'm feeling short-tempered. You know, all of these very normal human responses have been helped by all the work that I have done to date on EQ and SQ, in particular SQ, putting my small self to the side when I need to, but also having compassion for self. Compassion for others is great, and you will run the well dry if you do not have compassion for yourself. So I have found myself, and other people are reporting this, having exhaustion, brain fog, interrupted sleep, lower productivity than normal, worrying about stuff that I can't do anything about, ruminating, you know, circling thoughts, finding ways to refocus on the things I'm grateful for is helpful, but also forgiving myself for having depressed days. And just saying some days you need to quit working. Just go take a bath, take a walk, watch idiot television, be kind to yourself, and then be kind to others, you know, so that compassion and kindness needs to go in all directions as much as you can. In terms of what is it going to do for the world? One of the spiritual intelligence skills is skill 6, the awareness of the interconnectedness of all life. This has been a massive demonstration of the interconnectedness of this planet. A virus that emerges in China travels around the whole world in no time and creates chaos everywhere. To the degree we cooperate on solutions, we reach solutions faster. To the degree we fight, we slow things down. Here in the United States, we've had this wild and crazy argument about masks, like masks have become a political statement. Believing that the coronavirus exists is somehow a sign of weakness. It's like anti-scientific and kind of crazy making. There's a need for people to bond around this anti-mask thing. So I try to have some compassion for it. And at the same time, it makes me crazy. It's like, don't you understand? More people are dying this year than needed to die because of this argument about public health practices. I hope where we will grow up from this is to quit being so tribal and small-minded and arguing about stuff that is clearly the real problem isn't the mask. Something else is the deeper issue that this culture war in the United States is going on about. The mask is a symptom of a deeper problem. I hope that God, spirit, life with a capital L is guiding us to greater wisdom and compassion by forcing us to face how interdependent and interconnected we are. So that's my hope.
And there is another question, Cindy, related to stages of development.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you touch that point, we know if you can talk a little about stages of development and how, let's say, how to deal with people with different background, with more wisdom and compassion, which is something very important in the today's world.
Right. So from a development, it's a big question. Developmental psychology is a huge field. Dealing with people at different stages of development is difficult. If you are more developed and you can remember how it felt, like if you're in the achiever stage and you remember when you were an expert and you remember it with compassion for your own self as an expert, you're more likely to be able to be compassionate for your clients who are experts. I find it is problematic if you move from expert to achiever and you have no compassion for your former self, you are judging your former self, you will then judge your clients who are in that place. One of the things I realized is I can't help someone I can't feel love for. Not the romantic kind of love, but the kind of spiritual love where I see and I understand and appreciate and have compassion for the place where they are at. If I am judging them as wrong for being where they are, they need another coach. So the most important thing as you go through your own development, I would say, is have compassion for your previous selves so that you can have compassion for your clients no matter what stage they're currently at. And then hopefully, because of that compassion, you will find the wisdom to help them take the next step. The caveat being, not everybody wants to grow up to the next stage. Some people are experts and are happy being experts, and you need to let them be healthier experts, not try to force them to become achievers or force them to become individualists or force them to move up to strategists. Love people where they are, help them become healthier where they are, help them take the next step that they are feeling called to take, not that you're imposing on them.
Thank you. Now, you touched that point, but just as we're getting close to our end point here, in terms of how can a good example of bringing spiritual intelligence in practice to your real world. You touched a little, but if you can elaborate a little more on that, in the day-to-day, how can we bring this to practice? You mentioned soul as one of the elements, but can you talk a little more about that as an example?
Yes, bringing spiritual intelligence into my daily practice means looking at myself in the mirror a good bit. So it all begins with self-awareness. Where am I hung up on my own worldview as being the only correct worldview. That's probably my favorite place to get stuck right now, is to believe I have the right perspective on politics, on healthcare, on So the challenge for me is to go into that complicated, two things are true at the same time. I can be passionately committed to what I feel is solving an injustice in the world. And I have to also be passionately committed to not hating the other side. Hate is corrosive. It is the opposite of everything I want in being spiritually intelligent. So understanding the other while changing the world is probably the challenge of our time. You know, how do we make the world a better place without demonizing and discarding half the population? So look in the mirror and do the work on yourself.
And there is a last question here about how is it related to the work from Pathwork Foundation? Maybe talking a little about how did you bring the model, because you went into several large areas to bring the model. So maybe that could be a conclusion question, a last question.
I'm not sure I know what Pathwork Foundation is.
Yeah, there is a, so it is, so there's a question, is it related? Maybe my question would be more general. When you build the model, I think you build thinking about the religions, psychology, philosophy. If you can bring that, how does that, of course, you talked about, let's say, the examples that we inspired you and us, but how did you build the model? Maybe that would be the last question.
Sure. For whatever reason, I seemed to be born asking a lot of questions. And as a young child, we were assigned to live in India. And I went from suburban United States, little white house, little white picket fence, I mean, typical middle-class home, to Mumbai, India. At that time, I had never been exposed to really any form of diversity, and I had never seen poverty. And poverty on that scale rocked my world. The suffering seemed so profoundly unfair that it, I think, set me off on this journey to how do we make this world more fair, more kind, more loving. And I think I just collected data for the rest of my life, you know, from philosophy, from science, from psychology, from religion. I was raised Roman Catholic. I ended up leaving that faith. I ended up finding a different faith tradition that was very nourishing to me. But, you know, I studied a lot of world religions in the process. You know, I studied Buddhism and Hinduism, and I was just fascinated by all of it. And as I did more and more and more reading, themes emerged. And then I started thinking about, who do I want to be? Who am I trying to become? And I was taking all these workshops to work on myself, but feeling like it was very scattered, not planned. And I thought, I wish there was a roadmap to help me figure out, like, study this and now study that and now work on this. And Emotional Intelligence came out as a book, and I was just amazed at what they had done with emotional intelligence as a set of skills, breaking it down to teach it. And I thought, somebody somewhere must have done this to help me become more like the people I admired, more like Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, Jesus, Buddha, you know, and I couldn't find it. And it kept me awake night after night after night for years. Like, I kept waking up thinking about this, and I think about it during the day. And I thought, well, if it doesn't exist, maybe it's mine to do. And I remember looking in the mirror one day after I had been thinking about this and kind of planning, how could I leave Exxon to do this work? And it took me about 5 years to figure it out. And when I finally I was getting remarried and I had enough money put aside to start the business and do the research, I looked in the mirror and I said, who are you to be doing this work? You are nobody. And then I thought, well, actually, that's a pretty good place to start. You're nobody. Nobody knows who you are. If you fail, who cares? So go do it. It's what's on your heart. And so that's how I got started. And the rest is just a lot of effort and focus groups and research and pulling it all together.
Thank you, Cindy, for speaking from the heart. Any final remarks, Cindy? We're approaching our time.
I would love if any of you are interested in learning more about SQ, please go to deepchange.com. There's a lot of free resources. And if any of you, we are really wanting ICF people to consider getting certified, and we offer a lot of core competency and resource hours for the certification training. So feel free to email me for more details at cindy@deepchange.com. And you can also see more information about the certification class and how many hours we offer. And Carlos, you've been kind of mentoring people in Brazil who have been wanting to get certified. So we have our own bilingual, brilliant, genius, high SQ person in Carlos ready to assist.
Thank you very much. Cindy, thank you very much. So I'm going to pass now the ball to Ilana to do the closing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, so much for this enlightening moment. We're seeing all the comments on the chat and the QA, a lot of questions, and people are very moved and interested in this subject. I think that is a little bit of your goal in this, you know, to give awareness about the subject to everyone. So thank you very much. And now I give the word to Candida to finish up.
Well, thank you very much, Cindy, e muito obrigada. Obrigada a todos que puderam participar, os nossos convidados de fora também, né, o pessoal de Latam. Esperamos vocês no próximo evento e lembrando novamente, para quem não pegou no comecinho, a renovação com a ICF Global vai até dia 31 de março, então estou reforçando aqui a mensagem. Muito obrigada a todos pela participação. Um detalhe importante, percebam que o CCUs, você agora clica num formulário, você preenche um formulário, não é um e-mail. Então a Ilana colocou várias vezes aqui no chat, preencham, cliquem, entrem no link e preencham com as palavras-chave, tá bom? É isso, boa noite.
Estão pedindo para eu falar a segunda palavra é compaixão, tá?
Isso.
Muito obrigada a todos. Have a nice evening.
Have a nice evening. Bye
Buenas
bye.
noches.
Buenas noches, exactly. Thank you, Cindy. Bye bye. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.